And then Cunningham gets into the face of DiJonai Carrington. So clearly was a foul. Was called.
Men should not play sports against women. I'm not going to get into all the bullshit that's going on out here in the world today. If anybody thinks that, I think they're stupid. I'm not.
Something went seriously wrong in the WNBA, and this time, the fallout didn't end when the referee blew the whistle. During the Indiana Fever's matchup against the Chicago Sky, Sophie Cunningham found herself at the center of a shocking confrontation after DiJonai Carrington chased her down on a breakaway and delivered a hard hit that sent Cunningham crashing to the floor. Officials reviewed the play and upgraded the foul to a flagrant 2, sending Carrington out of the game. But the foul itself wasn't the only thing that turned this moment into a massive controversy. Just minutes after being ejected, Carrington took the controversy straight to social media with a post that immediately ignited another debate: white privilege.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a hard foul. I don't think that DiJonai intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did. But it did happen, and I thought it was the right call. But, you know, one of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul. But I also don't think that she intentionally went for the net.
And suddenly, this wasn't just about one basketball play anymore. Charles Barkley, Sophie Cunningham, Caitlin Clark, DiJonai Carrington, and the WNBA were all pulled into a conversation about race, competition, and accountability. So what really happened, and why did this become so explosive? The game had barely gotten started when the entire atmosphere inside the arena changed.
DiJonai Carrington is such an unserious person, because what do you mean you commit a flagrant 2 and then you go to threads and play the victim?
Now trying to prevent the layup, but that is just a hard hit. That's definitely going to be upgraded, I think, to a flagrant 2, Ryan.
I think that is going to be a flagrant 2. There is wind up, there is follow through, there's potential for injury.
Like, that was such a clear flagrant 2. Like, clearly she almost took Sophie's head off. And I don't even like Sophie, and she got me on this internet defending Sophie. Like, but that was a clear flagrant 2. Like, there is no question about it. So the fact that she went to threads, and anybody called this, like, everybody knew she was about to go to threads as soon as she got ejected from the game. And then the fact that she tagged the Indiana Fever, what does the Fever got to do with it? The refs are who threw you out the game. It has nothing to do with the Fever. And to say white privilege, like, I'm just so confused. You are the one who fouled her. Like, what is not clicking? And it was 100% done on purpose. And I can only assume it's because of all of Sophie Cunningham's comments that she's been making to the media in the last couple of weeks about biological men and women's sports and all that. And like I said, I don't even like Sophie Cunningham, but girl, that was definitely a flagrant 2. At this point, I just have to assume that DiJonai loves attention and clout, because you clearly wanted attention when you committed that flagrant 2, and you wanted attention when you went to threads. I mean, this is the same person who outed her relationship drama on threads, so are we surprised?
Sophie Cunningham was running ahead of the defense, looking to finish what appeared to be a routine fast break opportunity. The Indiana Fever had a chance to add easy points, and Cunningham was already moving toward the basket when DiJonai Carrington came sprinting from behind. What happened next immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Carrington reached Cunningham near the basket and made a forceful attempt to stop the play. Instead of cleanly getting the ball, her arm came across Cunningham as she went up, sending the Fever forward crashing toward the floor. For a moment, everything stopped. Cunningham hit the court hard, and her teammates immediately reacted. The officials initially assessed the contact, but because of the seriousness of the play, they went back to review it.
Take a walk with me, take a walk with me, take a walk with me. There is craziness going on in the WNBA. DiJonai Carrington tweeted out white privilege from the locker room of a game that she was playing in. Get this, she fouled Sophie Cunningham hard. Sophie Cunningham, obviously a white person, fouled her hard. Flagrant 2, gets ejected, goes to the locker room and tweets out white privilege in the middle of the game. Now here's the kicker to me. A flagrant 2 has to be contact that can lead to an injury that looks excessive. DiJonai, it was about as excessive as possible. If there was any evidence of there being white privilege, this was not.
And that review changed everything. The foul was upgraded to a flagrant 2. That meant Carrington was done for the night. She was ejected. Now, if this had simply been a hard basketball play, perhaps the story would have ended there. Players get knocked down. Defenders make aggressive plays. Officials review questionable contact. That is part of professional basketball. But this situation had something else attached to it. The history between these teams. The history surrounding Caitlin Clark. The growing tension around Sophie Cunningham. And most importantly, what happened after Carrington left the court. Because instead of allowing the controversy to disappear with the ejection, Carrington made a social media post that instantly opened another battlefield.
I mean, just to protect her. That's it. I mean, you know, I got my teammate back always, so just to get out of the way.
Gotta ask about her response. She went in and she got on social and said white privilege after her getting
Who did this?
DiJonai did. Any response to that?
No, I don't know anything about that.
She wrote 2 words that would dominate the conversation long after the game was over. White privilege. Suddenly, people weren't just debating whether the foul deserved a flagrant 2. They were debating race. They were debating whether Cunningham had been treated differently because she was white. They were debating whether Carrington's post was a legitimate response to what she believed happened or whether she had simply turned a basketball incident into something much bigger. And that is where this story becomes much more complicated. Sophie Cunningham has never been a player who stays completely outside controversial conversations. Over the past several weeks, she had already attracted significant attention for her comments about biological differences in women's sports and the participation of transgender athletes. Those comments had divided fans. Some people praised Cunningham for speaking openly about her beliefs. Others strongly criticized her. And because of that existing controversy, the moment Carrington posted white privilege, many fans immediately connected the 2 situations. Was the foul simply a basketball play? Or was the growing tension surrounding Cunningham part of what made this incident explode? That question became impossible to ignore. But there was another important detail. Cunningham did not simply stay on the floor and allow the officials to handle everything. After getting back up, she confronted Carrington. The exchange was emotional. Players and staff had to intervene as the situation became increasingly heated. And that reaction made the scene even more dramatic. The crowd was watching. The cameras were watching. And millions of people online were about to watch it again and again. Every angle of the foul would be analyzed. Every reaction would be clipped. Every social media post would become evidence in someone's argument. And then Charles Barkley's name entered the conversation. Barkley has spent decades building a reputation for saying what he thinks, whether people agree with him or not. He has never been known for carefully avoiding controversial sports conversations. When Barkley speaks about basketball, fans listen. And when the subject involves Caitlin Clark, the WNBA, or the treatment of players, his comments can create another wave of debate almost immediately. But Barkley's position on this particular incident was more complicated than simply declaring Carrington a villain. He acknowledged that the foul was hard. He acknowledged that the contact was serious. But he also pushed back against the idea that Carrington necessarily intended to injure Cunningham. That distinction matters. Because there are 2 completely different questions here. The first is whether the contact was dangerous enough to deserve a flagrant 2. The officials clearly decided that it was. The second question is whether Carrington deliberately tried to hurt Cunningham. That is much harder to prove. And even Cunningham's own coach, Stephanie White, offered Carrington the benefit of the doubt when discussing the play. White described Carrington as an extremely competitive player and emphasized that she believed the play was a hard foul rather than an intentional attempt to injure Cunningham. That created an interesting divide. The officials had one responsibility: judge the action on the court. The players had their emotions. The fans had their interpretations. And social media had its own version of the story. But then came the post. That white privilege message completely changed the direction of the conversation. Because once race entered the discussion, the foul itself was no longer the only issue. People began revisiting old incidents. They started bringing up previous encounters involving Carrington and Caitlin Clark. One of the most remembered moments came back in 2024, when Carrington made contact with Clark around the eye during a game. At the time, Carrington said she was attempting to make a play on the ball and did not intentionally try to hit Clark. The incident nevertheless became one of the many flashpoints surrounding Clark during her rookie season. Now, 2 years later, fans were looking at another controversial play involving Carrington and an Indiana Fever player. And for Clark's enormous fan base, that history made the current incident feel far more significant. It wasn't just one foul anymore. It was another chapter in a rivalry that has repeatedly produced viral moments. And that is exactly why this story became bigger than the box score. The Fever would eventually leave the game with the victory, but the scoreboard was almost irrelevant compared with what was happening online. Fans were arguing over whether Carrington crossed a line. Others argued that the foul was simply part of an intensely physical game. Some defended Carrington. Others defended Cunningham. And then there were those who believed both sides were missing the bigger problem. Because professional basketball is supposed to settle these situations on the court. A referee makes a decision. A player accepts the consequence. The game continues. But when social media gets involved, every hard foul can become a political argument, every reaction can become a viral clip, and every old controversy can suddenly return. That is precisely what happened here. And the most fascinating part was that the controversy was still just getting started. Because while Cunningham was trying to move past the incident, Carrington's social media message had opened a completely different debate. Was white privilege aimed directly at Cunningham? Was it aimed at the officials? Was it about the reaction to the foul? Or was Carrington responding to the broader criticism surrounding her and the Fever? Nobody needed to guess for long. The internet had already chosen sides. And with Caitlin Clark sitting at the center of so many WNBA conversations, it was only a matter of time before her name became part of this controversy too. The question now wasn't simply whether DiJonai Carrington deserved to be ejected. The bigger question was whether this incident represented another example of the growing cultural war surrounding the Indiana Fever. And that is where Charles Barkley's perspective becomes especially interesting. Because Barkley wasn't simply reacting to one foul. He has previously spoken about Caitlin Clark, the attention surrounding her, and the strange amount of hostility that sometimes follows her success. So when another controversial incident involving an Indiana Fever player exploded across social media, fans naturally wanted to know where Barkley stood. And his answer wasn't quite what everyone expected. Because while some people wanted a simple condemnation, Barkley focused on something far more important. The difference between playing hard and deliberately trying to hurt someone. And that distinction could completely change the way you look at what happened between Sophie Cunningham and DiJonai Carrington. But the controversy was about to become even bigger. Because the social media post, the history with Caitlin Clark, and the reaction from the WNBA community were only the beginning. And once the old incident started being brought back into the spotlight, people began asking whether this was an isolated moment, or part of a much larger problem inside the league. The strange thing about this controversy is that the flagrant 2 was actually the easy part to understand. The officials saw the contact. They reviewed it. They made their decision. Carrington was ejected. That part of the story was settled. What wasn't settled was everything that came afterward. The moment Carrington's white privilege post started circulating, the conversation moved away from basketball and into territory where there were no referees, no replay review, and no final whistle. Everyone suddenly had an opinion. And the biggest question became this. Why did race become part of the conversation at all? To some fans, Carrington's post was an expression of frustration over the way she believed the incident was being discussed. They argued that Cunningham's popularity, her connection to the Indiana Fever, and the enormous attention surrounding Caitlin Clark had created a completely different environment around the team. From that perspective, the argument wasn't necessarily about whether the foul was legal. It was about whether certain players received different treatment, attention, or sympathy depending on who they are. But there was another side. Critics argued that Carrington's post made an already controversial situation much worse. Their argument was simple. If the officials reviewed the play and determined that the contact deserved a flagrant 2, then why turn the conversation into a racial dispute? And that question became even more complicated because Cunningham herself rejected the idea that the ejection was about race. Cunningham's response was essentially that Carrington could say whatever she wanted, but she didn't believe race had anything to do with the foul. That response was significant. Because Cunningham had been the person on the receiving end of the hit. She was the one who went down. She was the one who had to get back up. And she was the one who had the opportunity to turn the entire situation into an even bigger confrontation. Instead, her response was remarkably dismissive. She basically told Carrington to get whatever she needed to say off her chest. And that created another interesting contrast. One player was escalating the conversation online. The other was appearing to move on. But there was still one person whose opinion fans were waiting for. Charles Barkley. Barkley has never been afraid to criticize the WNBA when he believes the league is handling something poorly. He has also been outspoken about Caitlin Clark and the unusual amount of attention, criticism, and controversy surrounding her. And Barkley has repeatedly made one thing clear. He believes women should be allowed to compete in women's sports without the conversation being turned into something completely different. That position has made him controversial in some circles. But it also explains why his comments attract so much attention. When Barkley discussed the Cunningham-Carrington situation, he did not simply jump to the conclusion that Carrington intentionally wanted to injure Cunningham. Instead, he acknowledged the physical nature of the play. Basketball is fast. Defenders are moving at full speed. Players are reaching for the ball. And sometimes, especially on a breakaway, contact can become violent in an instant. That doesn't automatically mean there was a plan to hurt someone. But Barkley's larger point was about accountability. A hard foul can still be a hard foul. A dangerous play can still deserve a flagrant 2. And neither conclusion automatically tells us what was going on inside the player's head. That distinction is important because the internet often skips it. Online debates tend to work in extremes. Either someone is completely innocent or completely guilty. Either the foul was an accident or it was an assassination attempt. Either one player is a victim or the other player is a villain. Real basketball isn't always that simple. But the moment Carrington was ejected, the internet began building its own case. Clips started spreading. Old videos resurfaced. Previous incidents involving Caitlin Clark were brought back. And suddenly, fans were no longer discussing one game. They were discussing the entire relationship between Clark and Carrington. Back in 2024, Carrington was involved in another viral moment with Clark when contact was made around Clark's eye. The incident became a massive talking point because Clark's rookie season was already under a microscope. Every hard foul against her was being examined. Every interaction with an opposing player was being replayed. And every controversy involving Clark seemed to attract millions of reactions. Carrington defended herself at the time, explaining that she was trying to make a play on the ball and did not intentionally target Clark's eye. Whether people believed that explanation or not, the incident became part of the larger history between the players. So when Carrington was ejected after the Cunningham foul in 2026, Clark's supporters immediately remembered 2024. To them, the two moments looked connected. But that's where caution is necessary. A previous controversial play does not automatically prove that a later play was intentional. That's an assumption. And the difference between evidence and interpretation matters. Even Stephanie White, who had coached Carrington previously, gave her the benefit of the doubt regarding intent. White acknowledged the seriousness of the contact but did not characterize Carrington as someone who deliberately went out to injure Cunningham. That doesn't erase the foul. It doesn't change the flagrant 2. And it doesn't make the social media post disappear. But it does complicate the story. Because now we have several different pieces of information that don't perfectly fit together. The officials said the contact was serious enough for a flagrant 2. Cunningham appeared angry about what happened. Carrington argued publicly about the reaction. White questioned the idea that the contact was intentional. And Barkley emphasized the difference between physical competition and deliberately trying to hurt someone. Those are 4 different perspectives. And that is exactly why this controversy has become so difficult to settle. Then there is the crowd reaction. Carrington's ejection did not produce universal condemnation inside the arena. Some fans cheered as she left. That reaction triggered another wave of criticism online. To some viewers, cheering for a player after a dangerous foul looked like an endorsement of the incident. To others, it was simply a home crowd supporting its player. Again, the interpretation depended heavily on which side someone already supported. And that is the problem with modern sports controversies. The same moment can mean completely different things to different audiences. If you already believe the WNBA has treated Indiana Fever players unfairly, this incident looks like another example. If you believe Fever fans and Clark supporters have unfairly attacked black players, the same incident looks completely different. And if you're simply watching the basketball itself, you may see a hard foul, an appropriate ejection, and a ridiculous amount of internet drama afterward. But there was something else making this situation particularly explosive. Sophie Cunningham wasn't just another Fever player. She had already become part of a much larger cultural conversation. Her comments about biological differences in sports had placed her directly in the middle of one of the most divisive debates in women's athletics. That meant every incident involving Cunningham was almost guaranteed to receive more attention than an ordinary basketball play. And once Carrington referenced race, the two controversies collided. Sports. Race. Gender. Social media. Caitlin Clark. The Indiana Fever. The WNBA. Everything was suddenly connected. And that's why the story went viral. But there is a major problem with the idea that the incident proves Cunningham was deliberately targeted because of her beliefs. There is no clear evidence establishing that motive. It's possible for fans to suspect it. It's possible for commentators to argue about it. But suspicion isn't proof. The safest conclusion is that the foul was serious enough to result in an ejection, while the question of intent remains disputed. And that distinction is something the loudest voices online often ignore. Still, Carrington's post guaranteed that the debate wasn't going away. Because once the words, white privilege, entered the conversation, every previous argument surrounding the Fever became relevant again. People began discussing whether Clark receives special treatment. Others argued that Clark actually receives unusually hostile treatment. Some brought up race. Others brought up popularity. Others focused on the WNBA's officiating. And some simply wanted everyone to stop turning every basketball game into a political argument. In the middle of all of this was Charles Barkley. And Barkley's perspective became particularly interesting because he wasn't approaching the controversy from the exact same position as either side of the online debate. He could acknowledge that Carrington's foul was severe without claiming she intended to injure Cunningham. He could support Cunningham's right to express her views without agreeing with everything she says. And he could criticize the broader treatment of Caitlin Clark without pretending that every physical play against her is automatically malicious. That kind of middle ground is difficult to find on social media. But Barkley has spent his career refusing to make things simple just because simple answers get more attention. And that is why his reaction mattered. Because the real question wasn't whether one player should be hated or another should be defended. The real question was whether the WNBA could handle intense competition without allowing every controversial moment to become a cultural war. The league already has enormous attention on Caitlin Clark. Every Fever game attracts viewers who may not have followed the WNBA closely before. Every controversy surrounding Clark becomes amplified. And that means players aren't just competing against one another anymore. They're competing under a microscope. A hard foul that might once have been forgotten can now generate millions of views. A single social media post can become headline material. A comment made in frustration can follow a player for months. And a rivalry can quickly become a narrative about race, politics, identity, and social justice. That is exactly what happened here. The original question was simple. Was the contact worthy of a flagrant 2? The officials answered yes. But after the ejection, the question became, why did Carrington post white privilege? Then another question appeared. Was the post connected to Cunningham's previous comments? Then another. Does Carrington's history with Caitlin Clark matter? And finally, has the WNBA allowed its biggest controversies to become bigger than the basketball itself? Now the pressure wasn't just on Carrington or Cunningham. It was on the league. Because if every major incident produces another round of accusations, counter-accusations, viral clips, and social media battles, the WNBA has to decide how it wants to handle that environment. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. The league can control the officiating. It can review a foul. It can issue fines. It can suspend players. But it cannot control what millions of people say online. And it certainly cannot control what a player posts after leaving the court. That responsibility belongs to the players themselves. Which means Carrington's post may ultimately be just as important to this story as the foul itself. Because the foul lasted a few seconds. The social media controversy can last for weeks. And with another matchup between these teams approaching, the question is no longer whether Cunningham and Carrington will be able to move on. The real question is whether everyone else will. Because the next time these two teams meet, nobody will be watching it like an ordinary WNBA game. They'll be watching for the next moment. The next confrontation. The next hard foul. The next post. And if anything happens again, this controversy could become even bigger than the one that started it. By this point, the argument was no longer about one possession. The original foul had lasted only seconds. But the conversation surrounding it had grown into something much larger. Sophie Cunningham had been knocked to the floor. DiJonai Carrington had been ejected. Carrington had posted white privilege. Cunningham had dismissed the racial explanation. Fans had brought Caitlin Clark into the conversation. And Charles Barkley had become one of the most recognizable voices commenting on the situation. But Barkley's involvement matters for a reason that goes beyond this particular game. He has repeatedly argued that the WNBA needs to embrace the attention surrounding Caitlin Clark rather than fight against it. Clark has brought enormous interest to women's basketball. Her games attract viewers who weren't necessarily following the league before. Her jersey became a major seller. Her highlights dominate social media. And whether people love her or criticize her, they are watching. Barkley understands that. He also understands something else. The bigger the audience becomes, the more important it is for the league to handle controversy correctly. Because millions of new fans aren't just watching the basketball. They're watching how players behave. They're watching how officials respond. They're watching how the league handles discipline. And they're watching whether the same standards appear to apply to everyone. That's where the Cunningham-Carrington controversy becomes especially important. Nobody should be punished simply because fans are angry. And nobody should be excused simply because fans support them. The standard has to be the same. If a foul is dangerous, officials should judge it based on the action. If a player crosses the line, the league should address it. And if someone makes a controversial statement online, they should be prepared for people to challenge it. That's accountability. But accountability has to work both ways. Cunningham supporters cannot automatically assume that every hard foul against her is intentional. Carrington supporters cannot automatically dismiss every criticism as racism. Clark supporters cannot assume that every opposing player who makes contact with her is targeting her. And critics of Clark cannot pretend that every controversial moment involving the Fever is meaningless. There has to be room for facts. There has to be room for uncertainty. And there has to be room to say, we don't know. That's especially important when the question is intent. Nobody watching a replay can see inside another player's mind. You can analyze the movement. You can analyze the speed. You can analyze where the contact occurred. You can listen to what the player says afterward. But intent is still something that has to be established carefully. That's why Stephanie White's comments were so important. She didn't deny that the foul was serious. She didn't argue against the official's decision. But she also didn't portray Carrington as someone who intentionally tried to injure Cunningham. That distinction should be part of the conversation. Unfortunately, social media doesn't reward nuance. It rewards certainty. A 10-second clip gets more attention than a full explanation. A dramatic headline gets more clicks than a balanced breakdown. And an accusation can travel around the world before anyone checks whether the accusation is actually supported. That's the environment the WNBA is operating in now. Every game is being recorded from dozens of angles. Every player has fans and critics. Every controversial play can become a political argument. And Caitlin Clark's presence has accelerated all of it. For the Indiana Fever, that means the pressure is enormous. They aren't just playing basketball anymore. They're playing in front of a fan base that includes longtime WNBA supporters, new Clark fans, casual viewers, critics, activists, commentators, and millions of people who discover the league through viral clips. That audience doesn't agree on anything. And the Cunningham-Carrington incident proved it. One group saw a dangerous foul. Another saw an ordinary basketball play that went wrong. Another saw a racial argument. Another saw a continuation of the tension surrounding Clark. Another group simply saw two competitors getting caught up in an emotional moment. All of them watched the same footage. All of them came away with different conclusions. And that's why Charles Barkley's position is so interesting. Barkley has never been the kind of commentator who believes sports should be completely separated from real-world issues. But he also understands the danger of letting every sporting incident become a permanent cultural battle. Basketball has always been physical. Players compete. Players talk trash. Players get frustrated. Sometimes tempers explode. That doesn't automatically mean there is some massive conspiracy behind every incident. At the same time, physical basketball cannot become an excuse for reckless behavior. Those two ideas can exist together. You can support aggressive competition while still demanding that dangerous contact be punished. You can believe Carrington didn't intend to injure Cunningham while still believing the flagrant 2 was justified. You can disagree with Cunningham's political opinions while still believing she deserves protection from unnecessary contact. And you can criticize Carrington's social media post without labeling her entire character based on one message. That is what a mature sports conversation should look like. But this story isn't finished. Because there is another date sitting in the background. August 23rd. The next time these teams are expected to meet. And now, that game carries an entirely different atmosphere. Before this controversy, it would have been another regular season matchup. Now fans will be watching every possession involving Cunningham and Carrington. If Cunningham drives toward the basket, people will watch. If Carrington defends her, people will watch. If they make contact, social media will explode. Even a completely normal basketball play could be interpreted through the lens of what happened before. That's the dangerous part. Once a rivalry becomes personal in the eyes of the audience, neutral moments stop looking neutral. A routine defensive play can be viewed as retaliation. A stare can become a confrontation. A celebration can become an insult. A hard screen can become evidence of bad blood. And suddenly, the game is being judged before it even begins. That's why the next matchup could tell us more than the original controversy. Will Cunningham and Carrington simply play basketball? Will the teams keep their distance? Will officials be extra cautious? Will the crowd make the situation even more intense? Or will one small incident turn the entire game into another national story? Nobody knows. But one thing is certain. The pressure will be enormous. And this is where the WNBA has an opportunity. The league can use the controversy as another reason to divide fans. Or it can demonstrate that professional basketball still has rules, standards, and consequences that apply regardless of which team a player represents. That means transparency matters. If a foul is reviewed, explain the standard. If a player is disciplined, explain why. If a statement crosses a line, address it consistently. And most importantly, don't allow social media arguments to replace what happens on the court. Because the basketball itself is still the product. The league has incredible players. It has growing popularity. It has rivalries that people actually care about. And it has a new generation of fans who are emotionally invested. That's an opportunity. But opportunity comes with responsibility. If the WNBA wants to continue growing, it cannot afford for every controversy to become a fight between opposing fan bases. The players don't need to agree with one another. They don't need to like one another. They don't even need to respect one another personally. But when the whistle blows, the game has to remain bigger than the argument. And that may be the most important lesson from the Cunningham-Carrington controversy. The foul itself will eventually disappear from the news cycle. Another game will happen. Another player will make another big play. Another controversy will eventually take its place. But the way this situation is remembered will depend on what happens next. If the next meeting passes without incident, this could eventually become just another chapter in a heated WNBA season. If another confrontation happens, however, everything that happened here will be brought back immediately. The old clips will return. The old comments will return. The white privilege post will return. The Caitlin Clark history will return. And suddenly, one moment from one game will become part of an even larger rivalry. That's why Charles Barkley's broader message matters. Sports need competition. They need emotion. They need personalities. They need rivalries. But they also need perspective. Not every hard foul is an attack. Not every criticism is racism. Not every social media post is proof of a conspiracy. And not every controversial player is either a hero or a villain. Sometimes a basketball game is simply messy. Sometimes players make mistakes. Sometimes officials make difficult decisions. And sometimes social media makes everything 10 times bigger. The smartest fans understand that. The smartest players understand that. And the smartest leagues understand that. Sophie Cunningham will continue playing. DiJonai Carrington will continue competing. Caitlin Clark will continue attracting enormous attention. And Charles Barkley will almost certainly continue saying exactly what he thinks. That combination guarantees one thing. The WNBA isn't going to become less controversial anytime soon. But controversy doesn't have to destroy the sport. If handled correctly, it can create conversations about competition, accountability, fairness, and how women's basketball continues to evolve. The important thing is not to lose the basketball in the middle of all the noise. Because at the end of the day, fans came to watch players compete. They came to see who wins. They came to see big shots, defensive stops, comebacks, rivalries, and unforgettable moments. And that's where this entire story eventually returns. A basketball was thrown ahead. Sophie Cunningham sprinted toward the basket. DiJonai Carrington chased her down. The contact happened. The whistle blew. The replay was shown. The decision was made. Everything after that was a choice. The players made choices. The fans made choices. The commentators made choices. Social media made choices. And now the WNBA has to decide what it wants the next chapter to look like. Because the next time Indiana and Chicago meet, nobody will be watching casually. They'll be watching closely. And if Charles Barkley is right about one thing, it is this. The league is at its best when the conversation is about the basketball, not when the basketball becomes an excuse for a much bigger fight. The next chapter is coming. And this time, everyone will be watching. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think DiJonai Carrington's foul on Sophie Cunningham deserved a flagrant 2, or do you believe the officials went too far? And what about the white privilege post? Was Carrington simply expressing her frustration after the ejection, or did that post make an already heated situation much worse? And perhaps the biggest question of all, should fans connect this incident to the previous controversy involving Caitlin Clark, or should every play be judged completely on its own? There are clearly strong opinions on both sides, and I want to know where you stand. Drop your honest take in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button because it helps the channel more than you realize. And if you want more videos covering the biggest WNBA stories, Caitlin Clark controversies, player rivalries, and the latest reactions from voices like Charles Barkley, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because if the next chapter gets even more intense, you already know, we'll be here to break it all down.